Man's attempts to calculate the actions of the world have led to some of our greatest discoveries, but they have also led to some of our deadliest mistakes. In Halifax, Canada, a harbor collision results in an explosion causing unspeakable damage. In France, a car catapults into the stands during an auto race, leaving a wake of death and destruction. (1917). Over the last 3 years, World War I has reduced much of Europe to rubble. On the ground, fighting has resulted in heavy casualties to both the Germans and invading Allied forces. On the high seas, German U-boats and destroyers prowl international waters with cold stealth and precision, exacting huge losses on Allied ships. As such, the Allied forces find themselves employing every vessel available for service to transport materials for the war effort. In North America, one of the busiest wartime ports is the Halifax Harbor.
When we look at it now, it's rather a quiet place, but in time of war, Halifax was a very busy place. It was the center for convoys to gather for Europe, and the convoy system had begun just about a year, about the end of 1916, beginning of 1917.
One ship seeking an escort to France is a battered transatlantic steamer known as the Mont Blanc.
Mont Blanc was an old ship. She was only 20, 30 years old. She couldn't keep up with the fast convoys that operated out of New York, and she was coming here to look for a slow convoy that she'd be able to keep up with, going 5 to 7 knots.
The ship is captained by Merchant Marine Captain Aimé Lemedec on his first voyage as commander of the Mont Blanc. The excitement of his maiden voyage, however, is virtually extinguished by the nature of his cargo.
Cargo consisted of the following: 2,366.475 tons of picric acid, 250 tons of TNT, 62 tons of gun cotton, 246 tons of benzol. It was a 3,000-ton bomb. That's what it was.
Also in port that day is the Norwegian freight ship Imo, en route to New York to pick up relief supplies for war-torn Belgium. Unfortunately, Imo Captain Haken Froome finds himself in a less than ideal situation.
She was intending to sail on the afternoon of the 5th. Because of her designation as a neutral ship, they had a very low priority in getting fuel, so it was not until the fuel was available too late in the day.
As night settles on the harbor, the two ships rest on either side of a single steel net. When it opens, the two ships will meet for the first time in a way that will guarantee them both a tragic place in naval history. December 6th. The morning sun rises into a virtually cloudless sky over Halifax.
The next morning, you had Captain Fromm and Pilot Hayes aboard the Imo, and you had Captain Lemedec and Pilot Mackey aboard the Mont Blanc, both anxious to leave where they were and to get somewhere else.
The Mont Blanc weighs anchor after being granted permission to enter the harbor.
And there was an American ship came in first, picked up her pilot that morning, was inspected, and she was allowed to pass on while the Mont Blanc was getting underway. So the Mont Blanc was the second ship through the gate that morning.
Lemedec's first mate asks the captain if they should hoist the red flag as an indication that they are carrying explosives. Lemedec responds that it is not necessary.
International Code B was the signal for handling explosives. If a ship was underway, then she wasn't really required to fly that flag, only if they were handling, loading or discharging.
In the Halifax harbor, the Imo gets underway as well, heading out from the Bedford Basin towards the open seas, and its first meeting with the Mont Blanc. In the Richmond district of Halifax, situated near the harbor, residents meet the day as they have any other. 13-year-old Wilfred Crichton prepares for the day's classes.
I got up, had my breakfast, and we were going to have a geography test that morning.
A few blocks away at the Swetnam House, near K Street Methodist Church, the Reverend William Swetnam and his family listen to Mrs. Lizzie Louise Swetnam prepare for an upcoming church recital slated for that evening.
Mother's playmate was playing for my brother, and I was sitting near the window in a rocking chair and listening to it. My father was up in the hall and standing near the stove.
Similarly, near the Grove Presbyterian Church, the Crowdis family comes to life.
We'd had our breakfast. We went upstairs then, and we were in a room that had a south wall and a wall next toward the harbor. We were finishing getting our clothes on for the day, I guess. My Aunt Mary, the younger of the aunts, was there.
As his family prepares for the day ahead, Reverend Crowdis makes his way to the house of a parishioner. In the harbor, the outbound Emo comes across an inbound American tramp steamer.
The pilot of the tramp steamer signaled to the Emo could they stay off course so that he could go to the anchorage which he'd been assigned. So the Emo stayed off course, and instead of crossing to get to the Halifax side, stayed where she was on the Dartmouth side.
As the two ships pass, the American tram shouts across to the Emo that the inbound Mont Blanc is only a few minutes behind him, giving the Emo a chance to get into her proper channel.
When they had passed clear and the Emo had turned down into the Narrows, there was also coming up the tug Stella Maris.
The Stella Maris waits for the American ship to pass, then sets out into the Narrows behind it.
This caused the Emo to delay her turn down into the Narrows. They passed starboard to starboard again.
When Stella Maris Captain Horatio Brannan spots the Emo for the first time, he notices a ship traveling at an uncommonly high speed for the Narrows.
Meanwhile, here was Mont Blanc steaming up, also on the Dartmouth side of the shore, heading for Bedford Basin. They were on a collision course.
Upon spotting the Emo, the crew of the Mont Blanc issue a single whistle blast to signal their intent to remain in their rightful channel. To their surprise, the Emo answers with two blasts, signaling her intention to maintain her present course.
There must have been terror in the French captain's heart. He knew what he was carrying. Desperately dangerous cargo.
The Mont Blanc signals again, but receives the same response. As the gap between ships rapidly closes, the Mont Blanc has to act quickly.
What they should have done was stop their engines or put their engines in reverse. And what they tried to do was to maneuver around it. They tried to avoid a collision. They could have passed on the starboard sides rather than passing on their port sides as they should have done in such a narrow waterway.
For a fleeting moment, it looks as though the ships will manage to pass each other starboard to starboard. But then something goes tragically wrong.
The Emo at the same time now is with her engines stopped but still making headway. All of a sudden they were able to see what was taking place. They put their engine full astern again.
The reversing of the Emo's engines causes her bow to swing to the right, striking the bow of the Mont Blanc. The resultant shower of sparks ignites the benzene on deck.
The drums of benzol, one by one, were heating up and were exploding. They were draining down below decks where the picric acid and TNT was. It caused quite a spectacular fire, and it was like watching fireworks.
The daily routine of the Halifax harbor comes to a standstill as the spectacle of the burning ship draws the attention of everyone within eyesight.
My Aunt Margie and my mother, they had gone partway upstairs where there was a landing, and there were windows, and that's where they were, watching the boats burn.
Kids were on their way to school. You had people who had just been coming to work. Not too many people would have known what was on board the ship, that they had high explosives on board and they better flee for their life.
Regrettably for the crew of the Mont Blanc, there is only one course of action. As the benzene leaks into the deck below through the gash left by the Emo, it is only a matter of time before the Mont Blanc explodes.
The crew expected the Mont Blanc to blow up immediately. They took to their boats and rowed as fast as they could for the Dartmouth shore, shouting warnings as they went. People either didn't hear or they took little notice, but very few. No one seemed to get out of the way. No one was sufficiently frightened to do so.
They realized that once the fire got going, there was no way they were going to stop it.
The Mont Blanc drifts towards Pier 6 on the Halifax side, setting it ablaze. Nearby ships make preparations to move the Mont Blanc into the harbor to prevent the fire from spreading. Many of the people in and around the harbor have no idea that their end is only moments away. At 9:06 a.m., the Mont Blanc disappears in a flash of pure energy as her entire cargo evaporates into the biggest man-made pre-atomic explosion on Earth.
And all of a sudden, the house began to shake, and it seemed to get dark. And then there was a terrific crash. The door flew in.
I had no idea what was going on. Everything was falling apart.
The ship disintegrated. It just disappeared. There was nothing left.
The Emo is pulverized by the blast, which hurls her up onto the shore, killing Captain Frum, his pilot, and his entire on-deck crew. The shock from the explosion is felt over 200 miles away. In Halifax, the results are catastrophic.
It would have looked as if it had been bombed. Buildings shattered, the larger buildings totally collapsed, piles of rubble. Dust everywhere.
In a single moment, the Reverend Swetnam finds half his family dead amongst the ruins of his former house.
They had no idea what happened. Everything came down on them. The piano fell over, and Mrs. Swetnam and Carmen were killed. Dorothy was pinned under by debris.
The overturned coal stove ignites the shattered timbers on the Swetnam's house.
Fire was breaking out everywhere. My father, I know, was frantic.
Every time he pulled and tried to get boards away, Dorothy would scream and cry out that he was hurting and he was giving up.
He said, "Dorothy, you have to allow yourself to be pulled out of that hole, no matter how much it hurt."
Regardless of Dorothy's screams, he used his saw and hauled at the boards, and the two neighbors helped, and they got her out.
Likewise, the Crowdis house is instantaneously reduced to rubble.
The church and the hall were just kindling, and our house had collapsed toward the explosion because the backdraft had blew the house down.
Atop Citadel Hill, Reverend Crowdis is knocked down by the percussion of the blast, but quickly scrambles home to find his children safe outside the mass of rubble. There is no sign of his wife or sisters-in-law.
By the time he got back, we were out on the street. Not very happy, I suppose. But he got into the back of the house somehow or other, and he got my Aunt Margie and my mother out.
The Reverend's wife, Jane, is almost unrecognizable, her face badly cut and one eye riddled with glass.
So he quickly got his wife into a wheelbarrow to take her to the nearest doctor or hospital.
The explosion spawns widespread fires, the collapsed timbers of houses serving as ample kindling. The death toll mounts as survivors trapped beneath timbers are claimed by the spreading inferno.
When we got into the devastated zone, the houses were down, they were burning, there was smoke, and there was a sickly, sweetish smell. It was human bodies in the wreckage burning.
As the smoke begins to clear, the true toll of the explosion becomes evident. Hospitals are quickly filled to overflowing as the wounded and injured stream in.
There were people who were cut by glass, and that was because they had been standing at a window watching the ship burn when the explosion took place. There were a number of people that were blinded either in two eyes or at least one eye.
Among those are Jane Crowdis, whose eye is removed almost immediately.
The doctor who took out my mother's eye, he said he operated for something like a week on an average of 2 hours in the sleep a night, and took out about a barrel of stuff from people.
Rescue efforts are further hampered by a winter blizzard, which envelops the city in a blanket of white.
Later in the day, the temperature dropped, and a snowstorm developed, and overnight, a lot of the people who were trapped in the houses and who hadn't been rescued by nightfall died of exposure overnight.
The final death toll is pegged at over 1,600, with the number of wounded totaling over 9,000. With a city in ruins, the odious task of picking up the pieces begins.
The state of Massachusetts came to the rescue, and they had a relief train with nurses and doctors, I think within 24 hours in the way.
The temporary housing was started practically immediately as soon as supplies came in, which were fairly fast.
From the ashes, the city of Halifax comes together to rebuild itself, both physically and spiritually. Having lost many of their followers, the Reverends Swetnam and Crowdis decide to combine their congregations under one roof.
There was a temporary church built of tar paper, which all the congregations shared until a new church was ready. It was known as the Tar Paper Church.
And the intention was that when they got back on their feet, they would go their ways and become Methodists and Presbyterians again. But since they had this disaster and this emotion surrounding the recovery, they never did separate.
When the permanent church is built, the two congregations walk through the doors for the first time as a single faith.
It was decided that the Methodists and the Presbyterians would join forces and build one new church, which was called the United Memorial Church. And it was a precursor of the United Church of Canada. It was the first venture.
With the city slowly getting back to its feet, the people of Halifax now look for the cause of the dreadful collision that forever changed their lives. It will take 3 separate inquiries before an official answer is given.
The first 2 concluded that it was the fault of the French ship. It went from there to the next level, and it ended up, the final say was at the Privy Council in London.
The ruling of the Privy Council splits the blame between both ships.
The collision occurred because both pilots had failed to observe the rules of the road in a narrow channel.
With more than 80 years past, people still take pause to remember the terrible events of December 6, 1917.
My aunt picked glass out of herself all her life. Little bits of glass would work around and be cut out.
Well, I was only 13. You sort of rolled with the punches. We didn't have a very pleasant Christmas. I was affected. Christmas was never the same to me afterwards.
An accident like the Halifax explosion was something that the price that the city paid for doing business on the sea. There were certainly a lot of benefits to the community from being a seaport, but there were also some liabilities, and this, of course, was an extreme one.
I began thinking what Dad had to go through that day, you know, to dig his people out from under the rubble. We were refugees in our own hometown.
Less than 40 years later, human error would again result in tragedy for those on the sidelines in the small town of Le Mans, France. One of Europe's most prestigious auto races was designed by Charles Faroux in 1923. Dubbed the Le Mans, this 24-hour race is a test of both endurance and speed, run on the everyday streets of Le Mans, France, located some 200 kilometers southwest of Paris.
In 1923, it was the only race that continued through the night. The English tried well before we did to hold 24-hour races, but the law in England prohibited the Brooklyn racetrack from holding races at night. So they did 12 hours on Saturday, 12 hours on Sunday. At Le Mans, the authorities in the club of the ACO succeeded in obtaining permission for the race to be 24 hours non-stop. At first, it had only French participants and one English team. Then a few more English teams and the French, then English teams, Italian and American, and it became a world competition in about 10 years.
In the town of Le Mans, the annual race is regarded with great significance.
Yes, we are passionate about it, really. Yes, we really like the circuit. We grew up with it, living nearby the racing circuit. We've always been interested in the 24 hours. Yes, we would often walk on the circuit with my parents, my grandparents, and later my husband, and now with our grandchildren.
June 11th, 1955. People from all over the world are drawn to Le Mans.
Myself, I wasn't terribly passionate, but I went above all for the ambiance, for the pleasure of spending a day in the countryside, you know. It's true that it was very nice, very agreeable.
Among those in attendance are René and Denise Donnet, along with their 11-year-old daughter, Danielle.
The race started at 4 o'clock, so we left in the early afternoon to see the start. And we wandered around a little inside the grounds of the 24 hours. Because there's a celebration, there are plenty of attractions, there are plenty of things. And then we went to the edge of the track to watch the start.
Newlyweds Bernard and Jacqueline Chotard arrive at the race to celebrate their honeymoon.
I was just married, and my husband took a week off to fully experience the 24-hour race week. We went on the circuit to see the Jaguars entering the track.
I went and filmed the unloading of the Jaguars and the race preparation. Cars arriving, taking their places.
That year, at Le Mans, there was Ferrari who came to win. There's Jaguar who built the D-Type, which is an automobile that really is built for the 24-hour circuit. And there's Mercedes, which is the big name of the era.
Each of these companies are entering 3 cars, each with 2 drivers who will take shifts during the 24-hour race. Driving for Jaguar is Mike Hawthorne, considered to be one of the best in the world. Lance Macklin is racing for British car maker Austin Healey. Also competing is Paul Frere, who had signed with Aston Martin just a few days before being offered a driving position with Mercedes. His co-pilot, Peter Collins, will start the race at the wheel.
We had a light breakfast and I stayed near the cars to talk with the mechanics to discuss about the last-minute details before they started the race. About the start, I asked if Collins would start because I didn't like to start the race.
World champion Argentine driver Juan Miguel Fangio and French teammate Pierre Levet are driving the Mercedes originally offered to Paul Frere.
Levet was a driver who had most of his glory years behind him. He was never that great a driver anyway. Levet, before the race, found out that the car was very, very fast. Mercedes can go 280 kilometers an hour. He wasn't used to that speed. He was already close to 50 years old and he was practically not racing anymore.
Lingering in the minds of each driver is the very real possibility of injury or even death.
What I didn't like of racing was the dangers that were there at that time. The races were very much more dangerous than today, because the cars were not as safe as today. The driver was not protected against accident. There was no belt, and if the car rolled, there was not even a roll bar.
As the race draws closer, fans begin to fill the stands. Jacques Ayer, a freelance journalist, seats his wife and son and then makes his way to the press box.
In 55, I was a young journalist. I was 28 years old. I worked at the sports editorial, and on the race on Saturday, I found myself on the big press platform.
Railway worker Jean Lemoel is entertaining colleagues who have never seen the 24-hour race. He has brought along his brother-in-law and 11-year-old son. The 8-mile course begins on a straightaway that runs past the grandstands and pits and then under the Dunlop Bridge. After several twists and straightaways, it takes a sharp curve known as the Indianapolis before eventually returning to the grandstands. One of the most dangerous sections of track is the narrow straightaway near the grandstands. Only 3 meters wide, cars enter this section at speeds of over 150 miles an hour.
The straight lines of La Naudière are very debated, especially at the time that they were built. Some drivers were against the idea, and the ones that agreed believed that cars were going too fast on straight lines. And the ones who were against the idea were thinking that around 300 kilometers an hour, the straight lines were already too slow. I personally agree with that. When we were going straight with a car that was good and holding the road, we had time to check the instruments.
The flag drops at 4 p.m., officially starting the 1955 Le Mans.
The driver was in front of the car, if I remember. The car's door was mandatorily closed. We were running at the car and jumping up the car. Sometimes we were jumping over the car's door to be faster.
That's how the start was back then. The drivers jumped into their car. So everybody wanted to catch that moment. No one wanted to miss that part.
Juan Miguel Fangio leaps into his Mercedes and promptly gets his pant leg caught on the gear shift.
Fangio had a bad start. He's 14th, and Hawthorne is already almost 2 paces ahead. So there is a duel that will be born, and then there is reputation. Hawthorne is a young driver. Fangio is already 3 times world champion of Formula One, and he sees this guy who leaves before him, and it angers him. So he'll do everything to catch up. He'll pass, he'll take risks. Fangio will take a lot of risks to remain in the same lap as Hawthorne.
In the stands, Jean Lemoel's Parisian counterparts jockey for a better position to watch the race.
So I left my kid. I had a little boy of about 10 years. I left him, and I told him, I'm going to go with Monsieur de Villers, who was with me. I'm going with Jacques. Jacques was his name. I told him that we would come back for him in an hour or 2.
The Donnet family begins to make their way to the pit side of the track, hoping to find a better vantage point. But René is distracted by friends in the stands. 2 hours into the grueling race, Hawthorne is in the lead when his crew signals for him to make a refueling stop. Not wanting to jeopardize his lead, he passes the pits for 2 more laps, But bound by Jaguar racing policy, he must come in on the next lap to refuel. As other cars pull off, LeVay passes Mercedes teammate Fangio for second place, right behind Hawthorne. Fans are riveted to the drama unfolding on the track. But as they watch LeVay enter the straightaway, they have no idea that they are witnessing the final moments of his life. The blistering pace of the 1955 Le Mans race continues as the world's elite drivers battle for the lead. In the Aston Martin pits, Paul Frere prepares to take over from teammate Peter Collins. Hawthorne's Jaguar approaches the narrow straightaway, shooting past Lance Macklin's Austin Healey as he heads for his refueling stop. In passing Macklin, Hawthorne brakes hard to make his pit stop. But Macklin's brakes are not as powerful as the Jaguar's. Unable to stop, Macklin pulls to the left, putting himself directly in the path of LeVay's Mercedes, which screams down on him at 150 miles an hour. LeVay signals Fangio, who is coming up quickly behind him, to warn him of the crash. It is all he can do before his car collides with Macklin's.
All of a sudden, I saw a huge white flash. This image is frozen in my mind, as if I took a snapshot of it. And right after, I saw black objects smoking and smoking again.
Upon striking the rear of Macklin's Austin Healey, LeVay's silver Mercedes catapults into the air. The car heads straight for defenseless spectators in the stands.
All of a sudden, I saw the car, the Mercedes, literally taking off the ground above the people. And then I thought, this is terrible. That car is going to land on the crowd.
LeVay's Mercedes hits the concrete upright of the pedestrian tunnel that the Donnet family has used to cross beneath the track. The Mercedes gas tank explodes. The engine separates from the chassis of the car and rips into the stands packed with spectators.
Right after we heard people screaming, and I'm still embarrassed to talk about it. It was so awful. People were shrieking, screaming. It was panic all around. Nobody knew where to go.
We didn't imagine from the platform that there could be that many dead. The engine block and chassis had left like a rocket into the crowd at the height of their heads. There were lots of people there. There were even some children who were on their parents' shoulders, who had been split in two.
Bernard Chotard runs to the scene to film the accident, unaware of the gravity of what has happened until he arrives.
I said, I'm going to check it out. So I went there and started to film, although I had to stop because I could see some people were staring at me. So I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't be filming at that point. I remember, it was like a battlefield.
I turned around and I saw abominable things. I saw many bodies lying one on top of the other. It wasn't nice at all to see. So I asked my daughter not to turn around. She didn't turn around. She didn't see anything.
Denise Donnet shields her daughter, hoping that they will not be hit by the falling debris.
I put her against me. I put my arms around her. Myself, I turned my back to the accident, and I held her in my arms. The only thing she said was, "Take me back, my hair's burning, my hair's burning," because there was an immense heat coming from that car which had fallen. That's when she went to find her father.
In stopping to talk to his friends, René Donnet has unwittingly saved his own life and the lives of his wife and daughter.
We were between the first group killed and the second group, and we found ourselves more or less in the center. In all likelihood, we would have been in with the people that were killed by this motor.
Back on the track, Fangio navigates his Mercedes past Macklin's spinning Austin Healey and Hawthorne's refueling Jaguar without incident.
This gesture of Louvet, Fangio would later say, it saved my life. Why did it save Fangio's life? Because in raising his hand, he warned Fangio that he must not pass him before having passed the little car.
Macklin's car eventually slams into the pit side of the track as other cars whiz past in the narrow straightaway. Despite the horrific scene in the stands, the majority of those present do not yet know what has happened. Yellow flags are waved to slow traffic, but the race continues unhindered.
There was no panic because the accident was contained to an area of about 150 meters on each side. There were no spills on the track. The race continued, which was, in my opinion, the most important decision that was made. It was highly criticized afterwards, but in fact, it was the most intelligent decision since, as long as the race continued, people continued to watch the race.
Having taken over from teammate Peter Collins during the explosion, Paul Frere drives through the crash site on the straightaway. He is unaware of what has happened to the spectators.
I never realized that there were so many deaths in the accident. Because where we were on the track, we couldn't see the dead bodies like the public side did. We didn't know that a spectator was part of the accident. We only knew that later on.
Fearing for their safety, Denise Donnet frantically warns her friends to move their children away from the track. She is stunned by their reaction.
I started by telling them, take the children away from there. Don't leave them at the edge of the track. And they asked me why, of course. And I told them what had just happened. And I said, for me, you know, according to what I saw, there are at least 100 dead. So then they made fun of me. They said, you're crazy. What are you imagining? We haven't heard anything.
In the press box, no one realizes the severity of the accident.
I absolutely didn't see anything of the accident. I came at around 6:30 p.m. in the same moment that I heard the sirens of cars, of firefighters, and of ambulances.
We saw a collision. We didn't pay a lot of attention at that time because we didn't imagine that there was an accident like that. But when we saw the smoke, at that moment, my department head told me, I think there's been something important. Go see. So I climbed down the press platform and then did that 200 meters, 250 meters towards the crowd.
As word spreads, people converge upon the area, doing what they can to help.
The paramedics arrived. There had been journalists who had come, drivers. I don't know anymore who had come to help pick up the bodies. Help had arrived quick enough though. The ambulances, all of them arrived. So me, I went back towards the platform to say, there's a situation.
Jacques Aye's thoughts then turn to his wife and son. Jean Lemoel also returns to the stands. Amidst the blaring ambulance sirens, he frantically looks for his son and brother-in-law.
When we came back, it was like, what's happened here? No one was left on one side. What happened? What's going on? There was an accident. A car crashed into the crowd. Ambulances. As for me, I was busy looking for my child.
Fortunately, Jean Lemoel finds his son unharmed, but he cannot find his brother-in-law and continues searching. Jacqueline and Bernard Chotard leave the grounds, realizing that the crash has hit the area of the stands where they previously sat.
also have that image as we were leaving the circuit. Panic all around. And cars. People's cars were taking the injured away and were waving handkerchiefs as a signal to let them go through. They were driving the injured to the hospital.
Jacques Ayer manages to find his family amongst the fleeing fans. Jean Lemoel's search leads him to the hospital, where he finds his brother-in-law.
He didn't know where he was. He had certainly lost any notion about things, because he was taken to the hospital, because he was panicked.
Physically, he is fine, but to this day, Jean Lemoel's brother-in-law has not fully recovered from the shock of the crash. As night falls, paramedics and rescue workers clear the carnage of the Le Mans crash. Although Mercedes is leading the race by 2 laps, during the night an order comes from the Mercedes headquarters to withdraw from the race.
It was a decision that was made, I think, by the Mercedes firm. Because it's a Mercedes car that even somewhat caused this drama in the crowd.
Because it was a decision that for a long time provoked much discussion. Sterling Moss, for example, who was the teammate of Fangio, whom I met at the race this year, told me that the worst thing Mercedes did was to withdraw from the race, because withdrawing meant in one way or another that Mercedes felt guilty. Yet he told me that we had nothing to feel guilty about in this affair. It's a fact of racing.
Mercedes does not race at Le Mans for the next 44 years. The race ends at 4 p.m. the next day, with a shaken Mike Hawthorne emerging as the winner, followed by Paul Frere in second place. But by this time, the crash has overshadowed the race for worldwide attention. The Le Mans crash yields 82 dead and another 100 injured in one of the worst crashes in auto racing history.
There was a great inquiry that took place for over a year and a half. Behind the verdict was known in 1956.
The inquiry finds no one at fault for the accident.
Macklin's judgment did not voluntarily cause an accident. Hawthorne passed the car less quickly than he. He had to stop to the best of his abilities. So, his maneuvers were simply a result of a number of factors. It was a reasonable thing to do at the time, but it just wasn't enough.
The inquiry suggests implementing safety measures to the track, including a widening of the narrow straightaway and a relocation of the pit area so that it is further away from the grandstands.
After the accident, the entire zone was redone. The stands were demolished and reconstructed several meters to the right in an attempt to enlarge the road at this spot. Also, the EFIA, who at the time was called by another name, imposed an access zone to the stands.
For those who were there, the crash of 1955 is a memory that will live on for the rest of their lives.
Myself, I've renounced. I vowed that very day not to go to the 24 hours. I said, I'm not going anymore. I'm not going anymore, and I didn't like it when my children were taken, or my grandchildren.
The memory is particularly pungent for Paul Frere, who could have been driving the car that Levay was killed in.
Sometimes I think that if I hadn't had Aston Martin that year, that there would be 88 or 90 more people still alive. I think that sometimes, but that's the fatalist in me.
Others have not allowed the tragedy to interfere with their passion for auto racing.
On y pense, chaque année on y pense. Chaque année on pense à l'accident.
Every single year we think about the accident. But you know, we keep on going. It's a habit, and I go to accompany my husband. He loves it. He really enjoys going to the 24-hour race. He's always lived in that atmosphere, and now the whole family gets to enjoy it as well. I hope my grandson Mark, who has never missed a race, and he's only 12, that he will do the same, that he will take over from us when we won't be around anymore.
These two stories highlight the tragic losses that can occur through our own fallibility. Yet we must find a way to look past the horror of these events and do our utmost to ensure that they never happen again.